And if men want a woman who will give up all of her other choices and who will willingly stay home and raise the children and that works for them, great. I hope you find that. I hope there's a woman that exists that wants that too, and you're not forcing someone into that situation. But for all the women who don't or can't, they need options. So taking away those options from everyone just because you aren't going to be affected by it isn't how society works, and it's not fair.
Hey friends, and welcome back to the Tell Me Mas podcast. I'm super excited about today's show. But before I get into that, I want to tell you about some really cool news. So as you know, I recently started my podcast, and there was a ton of stuff that I needed to learn at the beginning, and it was a little overwhelming. So I wish I could have done so faster and without spending very much money at all. Well, today's guest is really cool. She is a podcaster. Her name is Paulette Erato, but she's also the founder of Latinas in Podcasting, which is a virtual summit coming on October 24th and 25th. And what that is it's a free 2-day event that's designed for people that are thinking about starting their podcast or maybe just started one out and really want to learn more of those skills to help grow their audience. You'll get to learn from top industry experts, connect and collaborate with a really supportive community, and get the tools you need to launch your podcast in just one weekend. Plus, it's all online, so you can join from anywhere. And again, it's absolutely free, so you don't want to miss out on that. Go to the show notes, click on the Latinas in Podcasting link, and reserve your spot for October 24th and 25th. And I'm sure it's going to be an amazing experience where I'm sure I will be learning quite a bit from this group of experts. So thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. Today, I have a new friend, a brand new friend who I amazingly met on Reddit. You know, how rare is it to actually make a real friend on Reddit on what can be a very toxic sort of platform. But I guess it was a few weeks ago I went on looking up how to suck less at being a podcaster, and she was in that little subreddit, and I saw her name and the podcast that she hosts. Her name is Paulette Erato, and she is the creator and host of La Vida Más Chévere de Child-Free Latinas. So as soon as I saw that title, I was like, I need to meet this woman, and I need to talk to her about that. And her podcast is amazing. I've watched so many episodes lately and love your style, love the way you do it, love what you're talking about. Super empowering. I love how you're going after and attacking sort of the social norms that we just adopt. Mm-hmm. And that is so interesting to me about the things that we simply do or accept because that's just the way we were raised. So I want to get into that, and we're going to be talking about getting into other people's business, which is one of my favorite topics, you know, and how people do that. Paulette, thank you so much for joining me today.
My gosh, that was quite the intro. Thank you
I'm excited.
Having me. I'm
excited
on the internet.
I don't know if I'd say normal, but you know, absolutely. I'm pumped. This is exciting. Can't wait to talk about the content. But before we get into all that, you know, this is our first time meeting face to face, and I'd love to get to know you. Who are you? Where are you from? Where's your family from? Give me your story.
I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm an 80s kid, which means I was a 90s teenager back when music was still good. And my mom is from Mexico, so she came over here in the 70s. My dad's from Puerto Rico, and they left the island when he was about 10, so he actually grew up in New York City. So he refuses to be called a New Yorican. Do not say that to Louis Fontanez. But he did have his formative years in New York City, ended up in Los Angeles, met my mom at a bar, and whoopsie-doozy, here I am.
There you go. Well, man, music must have been a big part of your household for sure.
Oh, yeah. What's really interesting is growing up in Los Angeles, you know, there's a huge Mexican influence here, right? The food is fantastic, but it's also a melting pot of other cultures. And
Sure.
So it wasn't weird to me as, you know, a kid of 2 different backgrounds, really, and growing up in a white neighborhood, let's be honest, that, I had rice and beans and pasteles. Like, that is the best fusion. And I didn't know that they were from different cultures. That's the food we have at home. Hay comida en la casa. That's what we're going to eat. And it wasn't until I was a lot older and traveled to these different parts of the world that I recognized these things are distinct, and not every Mexican eats pasteles at Christmas, as it turns out.
Or drinks coquito, I bet.
Or drinks coquito. And not
Right.
every Puerto Rican kid knows what a tamal is. Oh,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
I do.
Absolutely.
So
That's great.
it was,
That's great.
It was a very interesting blend. I'm very blessed and fortunate to have the background that I have, and the parents that I have. So, yeah.
Oh,
it's
that's
pretty cool.
great. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And how long have you been living? You said you've traveled into other places. Have you lived outside of LA?
Yeah, I lived in Puerto Rico for 3 months. It was a very
Oh,
short
okay.
3 months. It was not meant to be 3 months. It was meant to be 2 years. And I did a whole episode about what went wrong, and had my husband on the show with me. It was 2 years of planning, all for,
Right.
not the way we wanted it to work out. But I also went to school in Philadelphia for a little while. And I don't know if you want to keep this in the show, but I went to school with Donald Trump's son. So I got to meet him in the late 90s,
Okay.
after music started to
Eric
suck.
or Don Jr.?
Don Jr., he and I are the same age.
Okay. Did you guys hang out?
No, God, no. He was on the crew team with my friends. And
Okay.
so one time, a bunch of us had breakfast together, and I didn't know who he was because I'm from LA. At the time, this dude
Right.
was just the son of a rich developer in New York City or Atlantic City. I didn't know anything about
Right.
that. His dad did come and do a presentation at the school, and I was on the yearbook staff, and I was asked to shoot it, but I had the wrong lens for the camera, so all the pictures are really terrible. They didn't use them. Oh well. He gave a really interesting presentation. He went off on the fact that his son couldn't get out of crew practice to be there, so he went off about what an asshole the coach was, and this was like in the first 5 minutes of him opening his mouth.
That's
And
awesome.
then he was married to Marla Maples at the time, and
Uh-huh.
made fun of her in front of a room full of 400, 500 people. I'm 19 years old, or 18 maybe even, watching this. And again, I know nothing about this person, but my first impression of him is that is not how a real man treats a woman. Because I had never seen in my growing up, and I'm not saying my parents have the best model of a relationship, but my dad does not treat my mother that way. Or he didn't at the time. I don't know what they're doing with their lives now, right? I can't speak for my parents. They've been married for 47 years, 48. But yeah, so it was a very negative first impression, and nothing that has happened in the 20 years since has changed my mind about that.
Oh man, how funny! It's we can't not talk about him. It's funny and funny, and and even when we're looking at the content of your podcast, the sort of the theme there. I can't believe we've got to touch upon Trump and JD Vance and all of that, and so let's just dig into it. Tell me when you started your podcast, why you started your podcast, and what it's really about. You have a beautifully written mission statement, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to hear from you.
Sure. When I started the podcast, the focus was very different. It was mid-lockdown, like many people, and it was more about helping people find their creative spirit. It was called the Maker Muse podcast. My last name, Erato, is the name of one of the Greek muses. And I was like, I was so inspired one day that everybody is creative, and that was my mission. And I wanted everybody to find that creativity within them, because our society does a beautiful job of destroying any creative spirit a person has. And by the time we're adults, we've crushed that part of ourselves completely. And especially if you think that you're, left brain versus right brain and all these things that are it's just society's fucked up norms, quite frankly. Can I cuss on this show?
Absolutely.
Good. So the first season of that, I promised myself I could do 12 episodes, and then we'll see how it goes, one a week, and it was a lot. So learning 2 podcasts and then having this mission at the same time, at the end of that 12-week run, I was like, okay, that was fun, but I kind of want to pivot to focusing on the child-free Latinas who are creative. You know, where are my child-free Latinas? Because they're very hard to find unless you have this like beacon, because not everybody's waving the child-free flag.
Especially not Latinas.
Exactly. So I made it my mission to find as many women as I could, interview them about what it's like to be a child-free Latina, but also the creative aspects of their life. Because again, we were still talking creativity, wanted to inspire people to be creative. And at the end of that run, I realized that the child-free Latina part was the most important. So we pivoted. At the end of that year, I think it was late 2022, early 2023, I wanted to talk more about being a child-free Latina, and calling it the Maker Muse didn't make sense anymore. I was going to podcasting conferences and you have to talk about your podcast. And I was like, this is going to sound awkward. So finally I made the change, and the word chévere is one I heard growing up. Again, a lot of that Puerto Rican influence from my own family. They used chévere a lot. Like that was their go-to word to say everything was cool, everything was chill, everything's chévere. And so La Vida Más Chévere was born. And then La Vida Más Chévere, the child-free Latinas, is what it became formally. But I still call it La Vida Más Chévere. And now it's about, again, that societal norm, that those toxic societal traditions that make us think we're less than, that keep us small, that, you know, like the saying, galledita se ve más bonita. Like, that is not a thing we should be teaching kids at all. And I think about all of the ways that we view the world now and just kind of accept that some stuff that we shouldn't. And so every episode is an attempt to look at one of those and review whether or not that makes sense for us anymore. Like, I did a whole thing where I'm like, I don't like fish. And it's so easy for me to say that, but it isn't true. It isn't true. So it starts with ourselves. It starts about the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell to ourselves, and reframing what still applies and then moving on from what doesn't. So that's what the podcast is about. It's about examining toxic cultural norms through the lens of a child-free Latina, which is already blowing up a social norm because we're not conforming to this idea that we're going to grow up, get married, have kids, and all these things, because there's a bigger world out there to explore than just this one narrow life script. And anybody who wants to follow that and is happy, that's great for you. I'm not trying to deter you from that. I'm also telling you can find happiness outside of those, you know, coloring outside the lines, so to speak.
Got it. So, child-free Latina, what is it about because, and I've heard this from non-Latinas who are child-free, and I got to tell you, when I heard one episode, you and your guest were describing the difference between child-free and childless, and that is a question I had never been presented with. I'd never considered the sort of different meanings of those two words within the context of this conversation. So I definitely, that's really what inspired me to dig deeper. But child-free Latina, obviously women of all ethnicities, you know, face certain stigma, or what are sort of the things that make this uniquely special for the Latina audience? What are the issues they are facing?
I can't speak for all Latinas. I can only speak for myself, obviously, right? So I don't want you to think that this is the one correct way to look at this. It is one way. But for example, the difference between child-free and childless, it's a nuance that gets lost in the conversation, especially right now where we're talking about childless cat ladies. And so I made an episode about that where I'm like, if the party that calls us that is not interested in the nuance or the difference between childless and child-free, I'm just going to lean into that. But if I'm referencing the right episode that you mentioned, my guest Talia and I were talking about the difference. And she said, I'm not childless because it doesn't make me less than to not be a mother. I'm actually free, and it's freedom that I get from not having children. So that was a big distinction for her. And it's one that I also ascribe to. That's how I feel. I don't feel like I'm less than a person because I don't have a traditional looking family. I'm perfectly happy with what I have. I'm in a partnership. I'm married to a man who feels the same way. So obviously I found my person, and thankfully he also didn't want children. But we personally haven't encountered a lot of issues not having kids. Most of our friends don't have kids. We live in a condo building without a lot of children in it. It's mostly single people, older people like us who don't have kids. So, lots of people thriving in this same sort of boat. And, we're also in an area that's historically very gay friendly. So I love it here, and I love the people I'm surrounded with. There are kids in my life who I love and I adore. And, I got one started on the stock market, and every year for his birthday, I tell him he can have another set of stocks, based on how old he is. Multiply that by 10. That's how many stocks you can buy. So find something and then explain to me why you want those stocks, right? So I know that I'm having an effect on the children in my life. I'm having an impact, hopefully a positive one. Hopefully that kid is the one who has all the money, who can take care of all his family and give to charitable organizations and things like that. What I have seen online that other people are experiencing, and this is why I interviewed my mother as part of that second season to have the conversation with her about what it's like to have a child-free kid as a Latina mom. I'm a first gen, she had all these dreams and aspirations when she came here. Did I disappoint you by not doing X, Y, or Z? So that conversation, coupled with all of these experiences that I've read about where people are cut out of wills, or they're given less because they don't have children that they need to support, or considered, again, less than their siblings because they didn't give their parents grandchildren, or just these other weird things that happen when your friends start having children around you and you're the last one, you're the one that's left behind. So because I didn't necessarily experience all of those things, I bring women on the show who might have, so they can talk about their experiences, because I can't speak to that. I don't know what it's like for all of your friends to have kids. Like when my friends started having kids, I started making other friends. And that's not easy for everyone. And it's not like I actively sought that out either. It just happened. I live in a very large city. It's easier to do it here, right? As opposed to someone who maybe lives in a smaller town and doesn't have as big a social safety net. So I don't have the answers. So I try to interview people who do have some answers and who other people can relate to as well.
Right. Do you think that, where I believe it may differ a little bit for Latinas is that your family truly wants, especially if you're first, second generation, get that education, go to college, get that career, 100%. But also, be a great wife, start your family as soon as possible, have as many kids as, que mande Dios, right? I feel like there may be a little more pressure to be that everything sort of woman in our community. Would you say that's true?
That is what I have seen, experienced through my cousins and extended family, and also what I hear women say to me. At the same time, part of the reason I think I have been very lucky not to encounter some of these things is I'm not the first on either side of my family, either the Mexican or Puerto Rican side, to be child-free. I have cousins who are older than me. My mom had an aunt on her side who never had children. She didn't even get married until she was like in her 50s or 60s. And all of those people, without me realizing it, set this path down for me. They walked so I can run, so to speak. We've all heard that term. I don't know what obstacles or rumors they had to contend with, but I'm grateful that they existed. The people existed, not the rumors or any obstacles, so that my life is easier, right? So now it's my turn. It's my turn to make the next generation's life easier. So for all of the Latinas watching, whether you're in the US or not, whether you're in a culture that demands children of you or not, you don't have to subscribe to that way of life, to that way of thinking. You're the only one who has to live this life. And the podcast exists so that I can continue to amplify the voices of women like me who are Latinas and child-free, who are living a life that is not to the traditional standard and yet thriving in that life. And that looks like all kinds of different things. I've had bakers, I've had woodworkers, welders, women who work in the federal government, who have been on the ground in Puerto Rico as Puerto Rico was drowning after the hurricanes.
Mm-hmm.
So women of all walks of life, who we all come back to the one thing we have in common is we're Latinas and we don't have kids. And maybe in real life, I would not be friends with these people, because again, we're all shapes, sizes, political beliefs, all kinds of backgrounds. And so while we have this connection point, and it's great, it just goes to prove that you can find your people. You just have to look for them.
Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking that, there could potentially that one decides to be child-free, that can cause conflict within family. During the holidays, or inevitably every holiday, they're going to ask what your current relationship status is. ¿Y el novio dónde está? O ¿cuándo se van a casar? And then ultimately, ¿y los niños cuándo? Right? Mm-hmm. Have you experienced that, or your guests spoken about sort of that conflict that exists within sort of the family?
Yeah, it's really funny. The very first time that conversation came up from me and my husband was from his side of the family. By the time I got around to getting married, by the way, I'm 9 years older than my husband, and we didn't get married till I was 38. So my side of the family knew for nearly 40 years that Paulette is Paulette and Paulette is the way she is. There's no changing her. In fact, I have a cousin who's just a couple years younger than me. She has 2 kids. She remembers me saying when we were really, really little, because we all grew up together, and she was like, "Oh yeah, you knew you didn't want kids early on." And I'm like, I don't remember that. I just remember I don't feel like I made a conscious decision, but apparently I did and made it known. And I was a little kid. And so the family just recognized that's who I am. My husband's family had a little bit of a harder time with it. And he shut that down. That was his conversation to have because it was his decision, not mine. I wouldn't be with him if he didn't feel similarly, but there was a conversation very, very early on where I was like, if you want children, because he was like 25, 26. I didn't know my ass from a hole in the ground at that age, so I wasn't expecting much from him. I was like, right. If you don't, you have to think this through, because if it turns out you want kids, we cannot be in a relationship. That was the deal breaker for me because I knew myself. We met when I was 34. I knew myself enough that I was not going to try to cross that line. To that point, I had dated men with kids, so that was something I had entertained. I learned that it wasn't for me. And so going forward, I was happy. I was happy being single. I was happy. I was looking forward to a quiet life with cats and travel and spoiling the nieces and nephews I have. Now I've added a partner in crime, and we're basically doing that. We don't have cats, but we travel and we spoil the kids. And it was very, very interesting because he's white. It was very, very interesting how much his mother kept harping on it. So this is when I realized I had something magical in my circle of friends. Both of my bridesmaids were moms. They both had kids. The kids ranged from at the time, the age 4 to 14. So huge range. And his mother brought it up twice. First time when she was visiting us the first time, the second time when they were here for our engagement party. And he shut her down the first time. And the second time, It was just me and my bridesmaids and my mom. And this was at our engagement party. And she says, oh, but they're not going to have kids. And both of my bridesmaids, who I had never talked to about this before, but I spoiled their kids because they were like nieces and nephews to me, right? Like it just wasn't, it wasn't a thing we talked about because it was like me having curly hair. It's just, that's just naturally who I am.
Yeah.
There was no point in discussing it, right? Like I can't change my eye color. I can't change my skin color. I'm not going to change my stance on this thing either. So without me asking, without us ever having had a conversation about it, they both jumped in and rabidly defended the fact that not all women are meant to be mothers. And it was in that moment, watching that happen, that I was like, oh, wow. This is what other people are experiencing all the fucking time with their families. And I've never had to do that. And when push came to shove and I was put into that situation where I'm being what's called bingoed, where you're being thrown these, what's going to happen to you when you're older? Who's going to take care of you? You're never going to know love until you have a child, blah, 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 blah. All these things that people say to us. The people in my life who I trusted and who loved me and who accepted me for who I was went to bat for me. So I didn't have to. And that's what I hope everyone has for them. And it doesn't even have to be on the topic of being child-free. Like maybe you're just really into hang gliding. But people don't understand why you like hang gliding. But you've got
well, there's no Latinos into hand gliding. Let's just stop there. There's no Latinos into hand gliding. Bad example.
But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Or you're into lowriders. I don't understand why you'd want to have a lowrider. I don't. But there's people out there who love it.
Of course.
And if you're into lowriders, I love that for you. Right?
Yeah, I love that you love it.
Defend,
yeah. Good for you.
I'm going to defend your right to enjoy that. So it was that same kind of thing. And that's just what I'm trying to provide. I'm trying to provide all people who have kids and people who don't have kids, to recognize that this is a life option. That's it. It's just an option. And you can take it or leave it.
Right.
But if the people in your life choose to leave it, please support them.
Yeah. When you were telling the story about your husband, how he shut down his mom, you paused there. There was something a little else behind that. What did you feel when he did that? Or what did that just bring up?
It was a long time ago. We've been married for 8 years. We actually just celebrated 8 years. Our wedding is fraught with drama. So much drama because we chose to have a child-free wedding. His entire side of the family boycotted our wedding, despite knowing for nearly a year that it was going to be child-free. There were only 2 children who were coming to the wedding from that side of the family.
And can we pause on that? Because I dealt with that many years ago as well. Like, it was so stressful to decide to put that on the wedding invitation. Por favor, no traigan niños. And, even my ex-mother-in-law at the time, she was like, oh, really? We're going to put that? We're going to say that? We're like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of, it's a classy place. Let's, make it enjoyable for everyone. So there's not. And it was so stressful just to make the decision to put that on there. It was nuts.
I mean, I've done a whole episode where I walk people through how to do it, how to communicate it. We told people in person, to their faces, face to face, in person, not on a video call, in person. We were at their homes. Yeah, it is a child-free wedding. We're going to have babysitters. The babysitters we had were bonded, by the state. These weren't just random strangers watching your kids. These were, child development specialists that we had hired. They had a suite right next to our ballroom. The kids were going to be no more than 100 feet away, being entertained, being enriched. There was only going to be 4 of them. They were ages 4 to 10. And that...
I mean, that sounds awesome. That sounds like a great way to have a party. I mean...
That was totally acceptable until 2 weeks before the wedding, when all of a sudden... my husband's brother just decided to pull rank, and being the golden child, his mom took the brother's side. Wow. Luckily, my husband and I had learned from watching, again, I'm the older bride. I had watched lots of my friends get married and had learned from their mistakes. And one roommate I had in college got engaged, and she's like, we are going to couples counseling. And I was like, why? What's wrong? And she's like, nothing. I want to keep it that way. So we were in couples counseling at the time. I was like, oh, that was a good tip. And our counselor walked us through the appropriate response so that we didn't have to feel bad. On top of, we didn't have to feel more bad about our decisions, other than how bad we were being made to feel at the time. And we could walk away with hands clean. Now, what his family did not know is at the time we were already married. Our wedding day is June 1st.
Oh,
We had
you dirty
eloped.
kids. You dirty
We
bad
had eloped with
kids.
the permission of our therapist because we knew this was going to happen. I knew. I could sense it. I knew shit was going to go down. I'm like, your mom's going to do something she's going to do something. Do you want to just go down to the courthouse? And he was like, yeah, let's do that.
Let's just do it.
Now, I couldn't do it. I couldn't commit to the whole elopement without my parents there. My father's significantly older than my mom, and so he, at the time, was in his 70s. So I was like, I need my parents there. And he was like, fine, tell whoever you want. So I called my mom at 9:30 the day before. I was like, hey, what are you doing tomorrow? She's like, why? Why? What's tomorrow? And what's really funny, I heard much, much later on, was my father's first reaction to saying, Paulette and Ryan are going to the courthouse tomorrow, was, is she pregnant? I was like, do you not know me? No, Dad.
There you
I'm
go.
not. I just want to have a child.
There's only one explanation. That's the only possibility. Yeah. How funny.
So we did that. And then 2 weeks before
You just took the best
wedding.
breath. You took the best cleansing breath just now. That was awesome.
You know, I don't dwell on this very often. So when I have to retell it, it does take a little bit out of me. And as we get further away from it happening, the pain is a little less. But I watched my husband break down and the effect that all of these people metaphorically turning their back on him had on him. And that was painful. And I never want him to experience that kind of pain ever again. If I could shield him from that, I would. He's happy. You know, I every once in a while, I'm like, are you okay? Are you okay not talking to your parents? Because he cut them off. And he's like, yeah, I'm fine. So, you know, I talk about how my life is great and I revel in it and I wouldn't change a damn thing about my relationship with my husband, but I hate how it went down. I wish it hadn't, but you know, it also shows you strength as a couple when you have to go through stuff like that.
Yeah, and you know, so good that the advice you got of going to therapy as a couple, you know, from the onset to and being proactive with it for sure. And it's funny you mentioned that because I definitely wanted to ask you about sort of, you know, maybe the emotional toll that kind of comes with that, because you are getting just constant messages of what you are supposed to be. So clearly you've gone to therapy as a couple to discuss this. Is this something that you would suggest or have found is very effective for maybe other women should do in order to kind of help deal with that?
100%. And that goes for cisgender, gay, what have you. We live in a broken system. Like, the world is broken. There are people who are specifically taught and have mastered the science and art of helping us figure ourselves out despite of all that. And those people are called therapists. And so sometimes it's a little bit of a, you know, buffet. You have to like sample a couple different types of therapists before you find the one. It's like dating, except you're paying the bill.
Yeah.
Every single time, and especially if you don't have insurance. I'm just kidding. But I think therapy is beneficial more than, especially if it's secular. I have a significant roadblock with anything faith-based. So that's not something I touch. So I do recommend that someone who is, you know, not religious. And my experience has obviously informed this. And I know people have had negative experiences with therapists. I see it. I hear about it. I've had therapists on the show talk about it. But again, you have to find the right one. And I'm so grateful to that roommate in college who was like, yeah, no, we're going to therapy to make sure we have a solid foundation, because that's what helped us. And I think that also our society, one of these toxic cultural norms I talk about, is our society makes, there's the wedding industrial complex, which we haven't even gotten to yet, but like rom-coms are so toxic most of the time. Like the woman or the man just want to be left alone, but no, we don't take no for an answer. Consent
Right.
flies out the window. And so we're told these stories that are, if you actually examine them, they're not healthy. And so those are examples like, oh, you fall in love and it's this big sweeping thing and happily ever after. No, like what happens after? What happens after? You have to deal with the reality of each other. So people get married without living together, without really knowing themselves, without having the discussion about kids or about finances or about what are you going to do when you're older and one of your parents needs you. These are all discussions we had because a therapist walked us through not just the present moment, but what does the future look like? You're not going to have kids, so how are you going to fill your time? How are you going to handle when one of you gets sick or when a parent gets sick? And so we had all of these things laid out. And of course, we check in periodically because we don't know if we've changed our mind on certain things. We haven't changed our mind on having kids. He had a vasectomy. I had an ablation. It's like, I think I've hit menopause, so we're no longer. But, have we changed our mind about how we're going to view one of us getting sick or one of our parents getting sick? Like, what are we doing? And so we talk about that periodically and use the tools that we learned in therapy to have a constructive discussion as opposed to a fight or any of those things. My husband and I don't fight because it's always a problem that we're fighting against, not each other. And so that's how we approach the world. And that is a thing we learned in therapy. So yeah, therapy has been super beneficial. We got lucky that we found the right therapist.
I love talking about the topic of therapy. I'll be honest, I'm not gone yet, and I know I should, but I find the approaches. I addictively listen to Esther Perel and her podcast and all of her amazingly sage advice, and the fact that she does it with that Belgian accent to me is just, it's amazing. And so much of what you're saying sounds so familiar. My wife is studying to become a therapist, so I'm going to be getting therapy regardless. But luckily, it's for free, maybe. But so I'll definitely be confronting that. But one thing we talked a little bit about the family pressure and the conflict that can occur directly from the family. But there is certainly the aspect of the outside world, and not even, let's say, from politicians or from a media perspective, but everyday interactions. I remember my wife currently works in the medical field, and, some patients she's known for quite a while, but in a very office visit-y sort of type of relationship, not friends or like that. And
surface level.
They've asked, they surface level, and they've asked her straight up, so when are you guys having kids? And she's like, oh, and we don't have kids, and we'll see. And they're like, well, why? Mm-hmm. And she's told me how often that occurs. Like, well, why? Why not? Like, why wouldn't you? And she's like, what? How on earth? When I gave you my answer, what makes you go further and try to investigate it? Or like, are you going to literally try to convince me to have children while I'm about to, do this procedure on you right before? Seriously? And so, like, what experiences have you had or have heard about other women having in that sort of light?
See, what your wife experiences in those moments, those are called bingo. She could literally take a bingo, fill in all of these often repeated statements and questions and start checking them off. And before I learned that was a thing child-free people did, this is also how we manage certain interactions with family members, my husband and I, that we weren't looking forward to. We're like, we know they're going to say this, and the other thing, so we'll just play bingo, and we'll just call it a checklist. So it's this tongue-in-cheek kind of game, but it does actually help to reframe the situation because you're not the problem, society is. The reason people feel so comfortable asking and pushing the issue is because society, this fucked up place we all live in and try to thrive in, has made it okay. And the way that you change that is by opening people's eyes to the fact that it isn't okay to continue to pry into people's personal business, because you don't know whether that person even wanted kids, because there's a large contingent of people who wanted to have kids in this life and couldn't. And they've made their peace with it, or are trying to, and are on the other end of it, but still that's a painful conversation for them. That's not my experience,
For sure.
right? Like, I never wanted the kids, but for someone who did, how fucked up is it to continue to poke that wound for them? So the problem is multi-pronged. It's that we live in a time and a society where it's okay to continue to poke in that wound for people, or even if it isn't a wound, it's okay to continue to pry into their personal business. We need to stop that. So that's one. Two, we don't trust women to know themselves as a society, because the patriarchy doesn't value women having their own opinions. We see that happening right now. It's playing out in the political division, where one side wants to take all the autonomy and choice away from women, and because they don't value them as people who can make their own decisions. So that's toxic prong number two. And the other is that as women, we are being taught to just put up with it, to just be people pleasers. So this is all part of the mix that allows for situations like this to take place. How do I deal with it? I don't entertain it. What I realized I did is, because my brother's a little older than me, he's from my father's first marriage, his kids, when he was having them and when they were being raised, and I was working in environments with other women who had kids, whenever they would talk about their kids, I'd be able to talk about my niece and nephew and how, what developmental stages they were at. And I was very lucky. But, if I hadn't had my niece and nephew, there were other kids. My friends had kids at the time. And, I could talk about them in the same way. So when we were having conversations around kids, I didn't feel excluded, and I didn't feel less than, or that I didn't have something to contribute, because there were kids in my life that I could talk about, not in the same way as like when they were going through, potty training or something. Obviously I didn't have to live through that nightmare, but, surface level enough. So when your wife encounters those people, these patients who just feel comfortable asking, well, why not?
Yeah.
I don't have the answer for that, because every person is going to react differently. You can just say, no, I don't want them. The person answering has to read the room and take the pulse and understand what they're getting themselves into, if it's even worth the argument. But I think we talked offline how your wife is a stepmom.
Yeah.
We have a great, stepmoms are great. My mom's a stepmom. My brother has, married another woman. So his kids have stepkids. And at his wedding, his eldest son, who's 17, made a speech. He was the best man. He goes, she's not only a stepmom, she's a woman that stepped up. So, stepmoms are not inherently evil, despite what Disney has wanted us to believe.
Yeah.
So it's like, I have kids in my life. This is how it plays out. I don't need more kids. So I don't have the perfect answer. I don't have the answer that shuts it all down. It should be shut down at, no, I don't want them. But unfortunately, it isn't. So I'm part of a group of people who are trying to push that issue forward in the best ways we know how. And the way I do it is to interview women on my show.
Great. Thank you for that. I loved hearing, that approach from the stepmom perspective. Someone in the media who has been very, very open about his decision about not having kids is Bill Maher. And I found it really interesting that not too long ago, he was saying, like, look, let me help you understand. Not that I need to give you an explanation. I actually don't hate kids. I just, I just don't want them. I simply do not want them. And in episode, I think it was maybe 40 or 42, you were talking about that continued myth that child-free people simply hate kids. There's 2 or 3 kids I'm going to say, I do hate, and I'm not going to be apologetic about it. And there are some kids we should all probably hate. They can be terribly annoying, but you're empowered to say you hate some of them. But yeah, tell me about that episode and tell me about that myth.
So we live in a binary society, right? And people have trouble wrapping their heads around things they think are black and white. And one of those things is you have kids and you love them, or you don't have kids and you hate them. And this, for some reason, is an acceptable binary. And that's just not true. There's lots
Nuance
of
be
people who
damned.
hate kids. Nuance be damned. But think about how many parents you know or don't know, you've heard about, we see this on television, who are horrible to their kids. They should not have had them.
Yeah.
And if we lived in a society that was a little bit more accepting a few generations back of people not doing that, not following this formula to happiness, and thought, okay, no, I would be a bad mom, or that doesn't sound like fun, and then didn't, yes, those people wouldn't exist, and their people spawned from them wouldn't exist, their progeny wouldn't exist. But at the same time, would those people have been happier and lived more fulfilling lives and maybe contributed something else to society instead?
Potentially, right.
Right. So hating kids is not related to whether or not you have them. Sure, there are people who hate kids and decided to not have them. Great for them.
Sure, of course.
I don't hate kids. I don't hate your kids. I don't hate. Now, the older I get, the more patient I become. Like when we're at a restaurant and the kid's crying, or when we're on an airplane because we love travel, there's a kid crying. I've become a lot more patient, which is surprising to me. So yay, growth. But hating kids is such a, it's just, it's the automatic response. Oh, well, if you don't have kids, it's because you must hate them. No, I just don't want them in my house. I also don't have pets. I have very low maintenance plants. Just because I don't have a dog doesn't mean I don't like dogs.
Right.
I just don't want to clean up after a big hairy dog. And don't talk to me about hairless dogs. It's not about the dogs. It's just that people are allowed to have different likes and wants and desires in this life. And whether or not you have kids has zero to say about whether or not you hate them. Because quite frankly, all too often the people that hate kids are parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me what it felt like. And, amazingly, like we said earlier, we now are forced to address the political issue. Tell me what it feels like when you hear that you are less vested in the growth and the future of the nation because you don't have children. You really kind of just don't care as much. And perhaps even your vote should matter less. How did you feel about that?
Well, that makes me angry. So I use my right to vote to not vote for people who peddle that kind of bullshit. So that's one. But it's really unfair that, and my last guest said it perfectly. She works for a California grassroots progressive agency that tries to move the needle forward, as she said, on the issues that will impact future generations. That's her entire job. And she doesn't have kids either because she's also a child-free Latina. But she goes to work every day to try to combat the propaganda like child-free people hate kids and they have no stake in the future, because we have a stake in right now, and right now impacts the future. And I mean, I've been on your show now for how long, talking about the other kids in my life and the impact I'm hoping that I have on them and the better lives I hope they have, and their friends and the kids that are going to come after them. I talk about this on my show a lot, about how what I'm doing sets the path. Like I said earlier, it's my turn to set up the next generation so they recognize their options. Of course I'm invested in the future, because in the future I still exist. 10 years from now, I hope to still exist. So I have to live in that world too. So the people who only care about the future because of their kids, I mean, that's messed up. So you didn't care before you had kids, which is, I think, what they're telling on themselves. But at the same time, there's too many people that just don't give a shit about anything until it affects them. And for a lot of people, they don't give a shit about the future until they have kids. Because, wait, our planet wouldn't be in such disarray if previous generations had cared more about the future. And those previous generations had kids. So make that make sense for me, Victor.
Well, I can't. I mean, I had to get your response to that, but the truth is it's an illogical statement. Mm-hmm. And I'm certainly glad that it's perhaps not been debated as much because it's really not worth. It's not a topic that's worth debating because it's simply inane, surely. And what I think is I found terribly offensive is, the childless cat lady label. I mean, just as illogical, just as stupid, but seems to be meant to be hurtful, and more sad of the fact that some people, I think, felt good about the statement. Oh yeah, those are the crazy liberal cat people, trying to destroy America. And again, silliness. And I don't want to actually talk about that as much because it's just
And the
it's silly
misogyny
and
that's wrapped up in that.
just a tiny bit.
My point around that is that in a different time period, people like me would have been considered witches and cast out of society, or worse, right? Been put on trial because of our witchery. And the whole archetype of a witch was a smear campaign in Europe to devalue women who were making beer, of all things. Men realized you can make money at making beer, and it was no longer women's work then. So this isn't new. This has been happening for eons. We're better prepared to combat it now, but it's just plain old misogyny. That's all it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, everything else that's wrapped into that.
Yeah. And funny enough, they never wrapped up child-free priests and nuns because, I guess they care about the future. But so moving on from that one, you haven't just spoken to child-free Latinas on the podcast, but actually men as well. Can you give me some highlight of kind of how that discussion goes and what differences may exist there?
I think at this point I've had 4 men on the show, 2 straight, 2 gay, 3 of them child-free. So I had my brother, obviously he has kids, and we talked about that. And I asked him the question, how does it affect you that I don't have kids? And he's like, it doesn't. It doesn't. You have more time and money to give to my kids. So yay. Then there was my husband. We've already talked about him. And then the other 2 men were both gay, and they never saw themselves having kids. And then one of them, I remember saying his partner does want kids, but they have dogs. And the person I was interviewing, is the disciplinarian. His husband is not. And he thought that dynamic would play out with children as well. And so that was his hesitation, aside from he himself not wanting them. He's in a partnership where I guess it wasn't a deal breaker like it was for me. So again, a different experience than mine. And that is something I can't fathom. I would not have married my husband if he had been on the fence about kids even.
Right.
I wasn't going there. I wasn't getting into a relationship with him. The men I've had, they're also both, and they're 2 men out of billions. So they are
Sure.
not the only ones who experience this. They had different approaches to life and different ideals, but children just didn't fit into their life vision. And it's always nice to talk to men because women have way more at stake in this conversation, right? Like,
Sure. Absolutely.
we've got all the plumbing, we do all the labor, pun intended. And men,
Well done.
when a man tells me he wants kids, I was like, that was always so confusing to me because we see how the division of labor plays out with the emotional labor, the mental labor, the literal labor of birthing a child. And, men are just on the sidelines for all of that, for a lot of it. And so it's just always weird to me when people are like, yeah, I want 10 kids. And I'm like, good luck finding a woman who is open to that after the first one. Maybe in this day and age, that's expensive. Not to mention, there was a time in the existence of humans where that made sense because you needed the labor.
The labor, to work the field.
Right.
And it was also a sign of wealth,
It was a sign
the
of
more kids
wealth.
you had. Yeah.
More kids, more mouths you have to feed. But in this
Yeah.
day and age, we're still being indoctrinated to create more workers. It's just for the system, not for ourselves. Like, we don't have our own farms. We have a system that we have to feed labor to. We have to feed laborers to. So, it's kind of gross. But
And it's interesting, in the man verse of the YouTube, there is a set of guys, of influencer that are really pushing. I mean, they're the finance bros, right? Who are all about, we need to bring back the traditional family, where you need to find that wife who isn't this modern feminist who wants this career, but who prioritizes family. And that means one thing only, is she's at home having as many kids as possible. And they're they're tying it into, that's the ultimate way to be a true patriot, and actually love your country is by,
again,
just starting your
indoctrination and
billionaire
propaganda.
company overnight,
Yeah, overnight success.
Yeah.
You said something just now that triggered a thought. So at a podcasting conference of all places, I was talking with a couple of men, and one of them mentioned that his wife was like, women just need to shut the fuck up. We don't want to work. We want to stay home. We
That's
want
a
the men to
big
take
thing.
care of us. And it's great if that's what you want and you can have. That's great. But, and what I said at the time, I was actually proud of myself for being able to think on the spot like this and not have the thought later, was, what about the woman who has to work because her husband died or left her or whatever, and she's saddled with 3 or 4 or even just 1 kid? She doesn't have that luxury. And again, it was this idea that it doesn't affect her because she does have the ability to stay home, saying this, but not every woman does. And they don't think outside of this myopic sphere that they have of their own lives. It doesn't affect them. So it shouldn't affect any woman. But the truth of the matter is, women need choices. They need to be able to take care of themselves in case they find, it's like insurance. Like, if I'm in a partnership and I have 3 kids and the husband is the breadwinner and he leaves, what the hell are we supposed to do for these 3 kids? Like, how am I supposed to survive, and how am I supposed to ensure their survival? Not just their survival, but keep them healthy and thriving, because those kids are going to grow up into adults and we don't want more broken adults. So the idea that women should shut up and just be happy staying home is naive at best, because the world just doesn't work that way. And if men want a woman who will give up all of her other choices and who will willingly stay home and raise the children, and that works for them, great. I hope you find that. I hope there's a woman that exists that wants that too, and you're not forcing someone into that situation. But for all the women who don't or can't, they need options. So taking away those options from everyone just because you aren't going to be affected by it isn't how society works, and it's not fair.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Could not agree more. So, yeah, I will continue to be a subscriber and listener because I love your approach, and
Thank you.
I love the fact that you opened my eyes to something that, again, doesn't necessarily affect me directly, but maybe I could have some more empathy around it and approach it in a different way, and at least see through someone else's eyes. I do want to touch upon your other venture that you're launching soon. Tell me about that.
Oh my God, Latinas in podcasting.
Yes.
That is actually happening right now as we're recording. It's the inaugural virtual summit for, okay, let me back up. Several years ago, when I started attending podcasting conferences, the very first one I went to was here in Los Angeles, and I was like, oh yeah, of course there's going to be a diverse audience, right? I took for granted that's what it was going to be. So I go, and it's not. I saw one person who had a banner. It was the advertisement for their show. And it said, Latinas from the block to the boardroom. So I ran, again, there's that beacon I was talking about, right? I ran straight to her, and I was like, where are the rest of us? And she was like,
it's just me and you, kid.
A lot of us here. Yeah, so you go to these conferences, and they're predominantly male and predominantly white. So even if there are men of color, there's few of them. So that was disappointing. And as we were there for a few more days and networking, I counted the people I came into contact with. And I'm not bullshitting you. It was like 17 people. So from that moment forward, I was like, how can we change this? So I joined groups that were more about people of color and, started networking with those people. But I'd still go to these larger events, and it was us in this tiny little room being shoved in the room with the D&D players who don't care about Latinas and podcasting. And finally I said, enough. If they're not going to welcome us at the table, let's build our own damn table. I took the lessons I've learned. And at first, I wanted Latinas in podcasting to be like a sorority kind of thing where we could just all rely on one another, mentoring, stuff like that. And then I realized I used to be an event planner many moons ago. I could create an event. So October 24th and 25th is a free virtual summit for beginner podcasters with the focus on Latinas and underrepresented voices. That is women, non-binary, all colors, shapes, and sizes. The point is to create that table for ourselves and to connect, to collaborate, and to launch. So I've brought together 19 women, mostly Latinas, not all, but they're all educating beginners on the best way to approach a podcast, from metrics to, where do I find my hosting? What kind of microphone do I buy? How do I edit? And I'm reviewing all of the content right now. Like as we're recording, I was in the middle of editing one of these sessions. They're all pre-recorded, so they'll be dropping on October 24th. And I am blown away by how good these presentations are. Me, as someone who's been doing this for several years now, beginners are going to, there's so much good content here for them to learn these things from women and from people who aren't male and pale, as I heard it said. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but we're not looking to create more Joe Rogans. We're not looking to create more finance bros. We're looking to find a space for where our voices are welcome and amplified. So that's what Latinas in Podcasting is about. It's free. It's 2 days. You get 24 hours. Yeah, it's free. You get 24 hours to view the content, and then we pull it because, it costs money to keep stuff up. So if you want more than 2 days, we have 2 low-cost replay options. One, and there's a bunch of bonuses, by the way. There's you have a credit to start your podcast hosting, a free month of Descript and stuff like that. But if you just want more than 2 days to watch the content and get access to those freebies, we've got that. If you want extended access and some other goodies that we have put together, there's another option. So you'll have access to all that content for an extra year until we do the next one, because by then the content may have changed. Like the way you approach podcasting may have changed. So the stuff we're doing today and the stuff people are going to be learning today at the end of this month may no longer apply. So there's going to be refreshed content, new speakers, and hopefully one of the people who launches a podcast after coming to this summit will want to speak at it next year. So hoping that it creates a pipeline, but also it's just a space to connect and collaborate.
So necessary. Love the whole concept. Love the whole idea. As a, kind of beginner podcaster, I could have certainly... beginner podcaster. Did it sound like beaner? But
it did sound like beaner. Sorry,
not inaccurate. But I know I started mine not so long ago. Not approaching it necessarily from a strictly Latino topics, but I do know for a fact that our perspective. That's I think what my podcast is about. Is just talking about anything and talking to anyone that I find interesting, and just do it through the lens that I know is very underrepresented, and oftentimes when it is represented, it's misrepresented, and it's based on a lot of different assumptions. So I think that's great that you are forming that. Would be absolutely helpful, and anything I can do on this side to help out or contribute, more than happy to do so. Paulette, thank you so much for your time today. It's been so much fun. Love your spirit. Keep doing what you're doing and being that supportive for, your community. That's absolutely inspiring.
Thank you, Victor. It was great chatting with you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Take care.